Okay, cool. We'll go from here. All right, did the intro already. Okay, so plan for today. Mostly we're going to be focusing on ethics. So this is, broadly speaking, philosophy of morality, of right and wrong. There's lots of other kinds of philosophy that could be useful to debating. Potentially some stuff on, for instance, consciousness for AI. But just given time constraints, we're going to focus mostly on morality because I think that that is what is most directly useful. We're going to be talking, as you can see, about three things. The first two are positions in what we call normative ethics, so theories about what makes something, a particular action, right or wrong. I'm going to do a little bit at the end on free will if we have time, because that is something that comes up occasionally, and I think people misunderstand it. As mentioned as well, I'm not going to be covering more general stuff on how to make principled arguments and what the techniques of doing that are. I'm more giving you here content uh, for to fill in those principled arguments. But there are other good workshops on executing principled arguments, what sorts of burdens you might need to fulfill. And I hope that this PowerPoint can be shared after, so you can see I've included a few links. The one I've linked to is a workshop by Lucia Darce, which I think is the best one on principled stuff. Okay. As I said, again, these are huge subjects. I'm only going to be able to cover them briefly. I'm really nerdy about this stuff, so if any of you want more information on this, more books, book chapters, articles, whatever, I will have plenty of stuff, and you can feel free to message me. Yeah, just go through my Facebook. Okay, normative ethics, before we start considering the two views within it. So, as I said, broadly, this is about what makes an action right or wrong, or what makes a state of affairs good or bad. I'm just going to introduce that terminology because that'll be important later on. When I say state of affairs, all I mean is just the complete state of the world at a given time. So, some states of affairs at certain times involve lots of people suffering, some of them don't. They involve different people buying things, selling things, being in certain contracts. It's just a complete description of the world. So normative ethics is about, yeah, right or wrong actions and what morally right decisions we can make are, and as well, what sorts of complete states of the world are good or bad. We're going to focus on two of the simpler and I think more popular views in normative ethics here. Um, as you can see here, this is something that is going to come up very, very often in debates. Any time really when you're doing a principled argument that's asking you to do things like, for instance, balancing equality versus freedom, questions as to what sorts of things people should be held responsible for under law. All of those kind of trade-offs are things that you can bring normative ethics into. Um, I would recommend, I think some of the material here that's a little bit more sophisticated probably isn't going to be something that it's feasible to get into a 7-minute speech if you're doing a debate that isn't purely about philosophy, but you just want to make a principled argument in it. Like, for instance, there was a motion at Worlds last year, I think it was roughly believes that the Indian government should prioritize greater economic equality over economic growth. It's fine to make a principled argument in that, and you should include some, philosophical content. Probably you're not going to have time to do the more sophisticated philosophical content. This would really come out on motions that are very explicitly about philosophy. But nevertheless, I do still think a lot of this is going to be useful. Okay, we're going to talk about utilitarianism first off, because this is something that comes up a lot, and I think debaters don't always understand, but is a really, really important thing to be able to support in debates, and also something that's really important to be able to criticize. Um, okay, so what is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism, as I said, a view in normative ethics about what is right or wrong. It's first of all a view about what makes a state of affairs better or worse, what makes one good or bad. And the utilitarian's answer to that is simple. It's how much utility there is in that state of affairs. Um, as a corollary to that, utilitarians also believe that right or wrong, whether an action is right or wrong, depends on whether they produce a state of affairs that is better or worse. And the utilitarian understands what makes a state of affairs good or bad in terms of utility. So, in a nutshell, utilitarians think the right thing to do is, roughly speaking, what makes the most utility. That's the core of utilitarianism. I've included here some examples where I think utilitarianism could be useful. I would particularly recommend you watching, if you're going to watch any of these, the first. This house hopes that intelligent extraterrestrial life exists. This was the final of Euros in 2022 in Zagreb. It's one of the great online recorded finals, and opening up in that final, opening opposition, which was a team from Trinity College Dublin of Dylan McCarthy and Jack Palmer. Some of you might know him. Defended utilitarianism and used that to win the debate in a really creative and interesting way. And I think there's some fantastic content in there, so I would really strongly recommend watching that if you're going to watch anything from here. Euros Final 2022. What is utility? This is something, again, that I think debaters sometimes misunderstand. There are different ways of understanding what utility is. The most common idea, and we're going to mostly focus on this definition here, is just in terms of pleasure and pain. So pleasurable states, I don't know, states when you're happy, when you have sex, or, whatever, you're having a good time. These are states that have positive utility. And unpleasurable or painful states, like, I don't know, if you broke your leg, you're tortured, or you're depressed, these have disutility. And the idea is that for every psychological state you could be in, or at least like conscious states, every one of those states has a certain amount of utility. It's just a simple way of saying some states are good for people to be in, and some states are bad for people to be in. Some ones feel good or feel bad. There is another way of doing the definition in terms of preference satisfaction. So some utilitarians prefer to say that how much utility there is in a state of affair is a matter of whether people's preferences are satisfied in that. I'm going to ignore that complication. I'm just bringing it up in case anybody has heard this and gets confused on this. We'll stick to the simpler definition here. The second one introduces a lot of complications that I don't think we need. Is everybody good on that so far? Basic definitions. Okay, I will take that as a yes. I would also just say if at any point people are confused or have questions, feel free to unmute, jump in. I don't want this to just be a lecture. But I am aware
I just
that
have one question here.
go ahead.
So I think like if we go by the second definition, do you think that that can then contradict the first definition? So it's like if I'm just a masochist, or I probably just have something else that I value, like truth or something, and I always prioritize that over any kind of pleasure, then like is that still like considered like utilitarian?
It would be considered utilitarian if you adopt a version of utilitarianism that works on preference satisfaction. It's probably not the more common definition of utilitarianism, but it is a valid definition. I am just ignoring it because it introduces a ton of really, really weird complications. But yeah, like feel free to follow me up on that. Like it is an important distinction. Briefly then on different kinds of utilitarianism. There's the second distinction we're going to talk about in a little bit more depth. The first isn't as important, but it's still of interest and useful in some debates, though probably not as many. One kind of distinction within utilitarianism is between total and average theories. So these are basically, there are some utilitarians who say, what we want to do as utilitarians is make the most utility possible. Other utilitarians say our job is to ensure that of all conscious beings that are capable of feeling good or bad or whatever, we want the average level of utility of all of those creatures to be as high as possible. Now, most of the time, the difference between these views doesn't matter, because most of the time, by doing something that increases the total utility, you are also going to be increasing the average, right? If you make somebody happier, that increases total utility and also average. There are differences do emerge in other kinds of cases. So one famous example is something called the repugnant conclusion, and I've included a picture of a guy called Derek Parfit, who is an English philosopher that came up with this stuff. So in this scenario, you're asked to imagine two worlds, one of them that contains, let's say, only 1 million people who are all really, really happy, and another world which contains, let's say, 100 billion people, all of whom live lives that are only barely better than not living at all. The point of the example is that if you increase, no matter how close the lives of the second population are to being just barely better than nothing, if there's enough of them, then there can be higher total utility in the second world than there is in the first world, even though in the first world, everyone is far, far happier on average. And there's then a question as to, according to a utilitarian, which of these worlds we should prefer. Generally, this is not important. I think the only debates I can really think of this being important in the alien life debate that I mentioned earlier. This is something that mattered and wasn't brought up in the round, but maybe should have been. Other interesting questions concern animal rights debates. So when you have debates about things like factory farming, a lot of the complaints that people have about factory farming are that animals that are factory farmed have very low utility on average. Um, One response you can say to that is, okay, but even if they're not very happy on average, if their lives are still better than not living at all, then if we have enough of them, it's better for them to exist than for them not to exist. So which of these views you adopt on could really make a difference in animal ethics debates? That's sort of the big example I can think of. Otherwise, pretty much irrelevant. There are other cases like motions about whether it'd be good for humankind to go extinct, but again, I'm going to ignore these. More important distinction: act versus rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarians think that the right action is the one that makes the most total or average utility. Right? Simple version of utilitarianism. Rule utilitarians are a bit weird. They think that the right action isn't the one that that action individually maximizes total or average utility. It's instead that actions are right if they are the action that a set of rules that would maximize total or average utility if everyone followed those rules. Um, an action is right if it is commanded by those rules. And this is a really important difference. So for instance, consider, let's say there's 5 people who are dying of organ failure, and there's someone proposes picking a healthy person off the street, stealing all their organs, which will kill them in a very painful way, giving them to other people to save 5 lives. It's plausible that that action on its own would increase average utility. And actually, because so many people find the idea that so many people find that action so morally disgusting and obviously wrong, they think that's a problem with utilitarianism. It's actually only a problem with act utilitarianism, because rule utilitarians might say something like, well, even if that action individually would produce more utility, if all of society were to be governed by a rule where you could take people off the street and steal their organs, that would be a disaster for utility, probably because people would like immediately try overthrowing the government or whatever, because that's horrifying. So rural utilitarianism does have that advantage of being a little bit more, and I think we'll see this as we go on. It has the advantage of fitting with some of our intuitions a little bit better in some cases. But as we're going to go on to see, there are some real advantages from a utilitarian perspective to act utilitarianism. And it might be that as unintuitive as act utilitarianism can be sometimes, it is still the right moral theory. It's just that our intuitions haven't caught up to it yet. Act utilitarianism is particularly useful, conversely, for justifying actions that would be bad if everyone did them, but might be good in this particular case. So, for instance, I've got a thing there about falsifying data. So there's a motion I saw. This house supports scientists. So assuming a low probability of detection, this house supports scientists falsifying data to exaggerate the impacts of climate change. To make people more concerned about it and fight climate change more. Now it's assuming a low probability that they're going to be caught. This plausibly is something that increases utility in the long run, because climate change is such a disaster and we're not doing enough about it. But in general, it would not be a good thing for society in terms of utility if scientists just made data up. So act utilitarianism is one way of justifying why it would be a good thing to do something that's right in this particular case, but would be disastrous if everybody did it. Final thing I've got on here is that one thing to bear in mind is you can have hybrid views. So one thing that a lot of act utilitarians say is act utilitarianism is ultimately the correct theory. It is the true theory of right and wrong. However, if we tried being act utilitarians, society would go terribly. So even though act utilitarianism is the correct rule, we shouldn't make decisions according to act utilitarianism. We should pretend as if rule utilitarianism or some other theory was true. This can be a bit weird to get your head around, but one example I like using is the paradox of hedonism. So what that is hedonist is somebody whose main goal in life is just to make themselves as happy as possible, and they don't care about anybody else. It turns out that people who try to do that end up being very unhappy. If you're just chasing at every moment what makes you happy, right now, you're not gonna end up with very many friends because you're gonna betray all of them. You're not gonna have a lot of meaning because you're probably not gonna do a lot of um, long-term goals and projects that are painful for a while, but will eventually lead you to be fulfilled. So there might be, if you were a hedonist, but a smart hedonist, you might try and think something like, well, hedonism is true. That is what I should be doing with my life. I should just be trying to make myself as happy as possible. But if you're smart enough, you'll recognize I shouldn't make decisions according to that rule because following that rule will not lead to me achieving my goal, namely of being happy. And in the same way, utilitarians can say, even though utilitarianism is true, we're not actually going to make decisions based on it. So that's an interesting complication. Everyone's still on board with me here?
Hey, a quick question.
Go
Wouldn't
ahead.
rule utilitarianism become super similar to deontology if we're talking about what's the morality of an action?
Yes, it is immensely similar to deontology. And this is, I think, one of the big problems with rule utilitarianism. In short, it's if you're a rule utilitarian, you might as well just be a deontologist. I'm going to come on to this more later, but you're exactly correct. This is a problem. Okay, going on. Defending and objecting to utilitarianism. So I'm first going to go through, because this is a pet peeve and I'm finally been given the chance to do a lecture about it. Bad and good bad ways that debaters talk about this that I don't like. The first thing that some debaters say when they're trying to argue against utilitarianism is utility is subjective. And by that, what I think they mean is just what makes different people need different things to be happy. And so debaters seem to think that if they point this out, then utilitarianism doesn't work as a moral theory. That's not true. Utilitarians entirely accept that different people need different things to be happy. And they would also, unless they're insane, they would agree that that means that in a lot of cases, it's hard for me to know what makes you happy. And so it might be that in a lot of cases, it's very difficult for us to know what maximizes utility. Utilitarians would accept that. What utilitarians are saying is just that sometimes there is a definite answer as to what makes the most utility. And even if sometimes we can't know that, that doesn't mean that an answer isn't out there, nor does it mean that there aren't some cases in which we can know it. So a good example here is it's a bit of a different case, but it's a good line to bring up when you're responding to this stuff. Is think about the distinction between day and night. So as day, we all know what day means and we all know what night means. But when you get to, I don't know, like in the evening or in the dawn, you're in the middle ground between day and night, and it will be unclear for a couple of hours whether it's day or night. There probably isn't a definite answer as to whether it's day or night. There's a middle ground, right? The fact that in some cases we don't know whether it's day or night doesn't mean that we can never know whether it's day or night. At noon, at 12 p.m. in the afternoon, it's definitely day, and at 3 in the morning, it is definitely night. So the fact that there is it's sometimes hard to determine this does not show that utilitarianism is wrong. So if people say this, please make fun of them for it. Similarly, here is a very bad defense of utilitarianism, and this is one of the few things that the people who won that Euros final that I mentioned got wrong, and I'm friends with Dylan. I've told Dylan this personally, because Dylan is they're also a philosophy nerd, so this is a complaint I have. Some people, including Dylan in that final, defend utilitarianism by saying utilitarianism gives definite answers to moral questions, right? Even if we can't know what the answers are, utilitarianism gives a definite method to tell us what the moral truth is, right? If we could know what maximizes utility, then we get a definite answer. And that might be a lot more definite than something like deontology, which in a lot of cases is going to be vague. There are problems with this, though. The first is that the fact that a theory gives definite answers, is not in general a proof that the theory is true, or even a very good reason to think that the theory is true. So I've mentioned day and night here again, but I'd also point you to examples from physics, right? As some of you may know, like within modern quantum physics, it's accepted that when particles are unobserved, there's no fact of the matter as to exactly which position they're in. There are some things that are just indeterminate. And so if you adopt modern quantum physics, you're not going to be able to give as definite answers to a lot of questions in physics as you would if Newtonian physics were true, or if, general relativity were all there was to say about physics. That doesn't mean that quantum physics isn't right. It may just be that there is indeterminacy in the world, and sometimes there isn't a right answer. So this is not a good argument for utilitarianism. The other thing that I've included below is that it's not actually clear that utilitarianism gives uniquely definite answers. There may be forms of deontology that are particularly strict, and which give definite answers. For instance, if you had a very strict form of deontology, which just had a list of 5 rules, don't murder, don't steal, or whatever, and had, some definitions of murders and stealing to go along with it, then that theory would give uniquely definite answers. So it's not at all clear that utilitarianism is unique in this respect. Okay. Here are some better arguments for utilitarianism. This is the one I particularly like. This will take a while, so I would not recommend doing it in debates where you don't have a lot of time. But in debates where you've got a bit of time, where it's a real philosophy motion, you can get your teeth into it. I think this one's about as good as it gets. And this is very common among philosophers who are writing on this stuff right now. Naturalism to utilitarianism. Naturalism's a view that all and only natural properties and entities exist. So roughly speaking, it's the sort of worldview that somebody who believes quite strongly in, modern science and so on might accept. There's nothing supernatural. Ultimately, what exists are the entities that would, be described in a complete and fully accurate version of the natural sciences. There is a question as to whether you can. We've tried defining natural properties in terms of what would be in the natural sciences. Presumably the natural sciences have to be defined as those that deal with natural properties. So there is a bit of a question about circularity, but for the purposes of debating, you can probably ignore this. Naturalism is pretty appealing. It's appealing ontologically. So ontology just is the philosophy of what exists. It's appealing ontologically, basically, because it's simple. It doesn't, if you believe in naturalism, what you believe, you think that all there is that exists are the things that appear in natural science. And what that means is you don't appeal to any kinds of beings or properties or whatever that we don't need to do scientific explanation. So some people like to think of this in terms of Occam's razor, which some of you might have heard of, which is a principle suggests, roughly speaking, don't make your explanations more complicated than they have to be. Choose the simplest explanation that posits as few kinds of entities and factors and so on that you need to explain whatever it is that you're trying to explain. And naturalists think that they're doing a good job of doing that. It's also pretty appealing epistemologically, epistemology being to do with what we know. Naturalism, if all that exists are natural entities in the physical world, then we understand how we can come to know about them, right? We do it via natural science. As opposed, if you reject naturalism and you think that there are some like spooky non-natural properties, there's a question as to how we could possibly come to know about them, given that we can never be in contact with them, at least causally, and none of our empirical science would work. We can make guesses about them, but it's hard to think that we could know about them. Is everyone on board with this? And there are reasons why naturalism, there are problems with it, but does everyone see why this might be an appealing view? Okay, I will take that as hopefully. I'm not saying that naturalism is true. I personally have issues with it. But within a debating context, you can sell judges on this pretty easily. Now, here's the way that you can use this as a utilitarian. Utility is a natural property, right? Whether you define it in terms of preferences or you define it in terms of pleasurable sensations, we're talking about natural things, right? Things within the physical world that we understand how to measure and so on. Now, it might sometimes be hard for me to get inside your head. We don't currently understand enough about psychology or neuroscience to be able to determine what makes you happy. But in theory, these are natural things. And so if utilitarianism is a moral theory that's based on them, it seems like a naturalistic one. It doesn't have to posit weird kinds of properties, moral reasons that aren't to do with anything that's not in the natural world. And so if you subscribe to naturalism, you might well want to be a utilitarian, especially because so many of the rival theories to utilitarianism aren't naturalistic, or at least aren't as obviously naturalistic. If you think about something like deontology, deontology doesn't say that things are wrong if they maximize pleasure. It says that things are wrong if, for instance, according to Kant, they violate the freedom that everybody has as a moral agent, or they don't treat people as ultimately equal. But it's unclear that those things are natural properties, right? They're not the sort of things that could ever appear in natural science. It's massively unclear how we could ever measure them. So utilitarianism might seem to have an advantage here. However, it's more complicated than that, which is always the story with philosophy. And I've included a guy called G.E. Moore, who is one of the founders of modern philosophy. Incredible guy working at Cambridge in the early 1900s. And he thought that utilitarianism, despite appearances, wasn't actually naturalistic, right? Act utilitarianism, as we saw, is the thesis that all and only, let's say, the utility maximizing acts are right, or you could say the ones that increase average utility, whatever, doesn't make a difference. Is right a naturalistic property? Even if utility is a naturalistic property, if right isn't, then it's not clear that utilitarianism is a naturalistic theory. And G.E. Moore didn't just think this was a possibility, but he thought he could prove it. And he did something called the open question argument to do this. The argument goes like this. Take any proposed naturalistic definition of right, right? Like say you try defining right as right just means something like maximizing utility. Moore thought that any such definition could be shown to fail because if you take any definition like that, let's say right equals utility maximizing, it will always be an open question whether the property mentioned on the right-hand side of the definition is actually right. You could always ask after being told that right is defined as utility maximizing. It would always be coherent to wonder whether is utility maximizing actually right? And he thought this was very important because if you compare other definitions that equate one property with another, there don't tend to be these open questions. So think about the property of being a father. It's very plausible that you can define father as male parent, right? That's what it means to be a father. And if you're presented with that definition, there's no open question as to whether a father is a male parent. If you think it's an open question, you've just misunderstood the definition. So he thought that because of that, it could be shown that whatever kind of naturalistic property you appeal to, including the ones that utilitarians would like to do, it's not going to work as a definition. This argument itself, however, fails. The open question argument at best only shows that the term right, the word we have for it, isn't synonymous, same in meaning, with any naturalistic expression, right? Like, for instance, utility maximizing. It might still be the case, I've included the word co-referential here, which is a bit of a philosophy term, but the problem with this argument is that even if the words are not the same in meaning, it might be that the property that the word right refers to is the same as the property that the word utility maximizing refers to. So here's an example, right? Take the words water and H2O. So we know from science that water is H2O, right? However, it took empirical work, scientific work, to discover that water was H2O. And for people who don't know enough chemistry, or for people back in the 1700s before we didn't know this stuff, if you proposed to them defining the word water as H2O, it would be an open question whether water is H2O. And that's true. The terms aren't the same in meaning, but that doesn't mean that water isn't H2O. So the basic problem here is confusing the terms, the words that we have for these properties with the properties themselves. So there's a whole other enormously complicated, philosophy literature on this. It's something I'm really interested in. But that should give you a picture of some really sophisticated stuff you can do with utilitarianism. As I said, I would not expect this to be possible in most debates, but in debates that are about philosophy, you may as well try and cook with it. Do people have any questions on this?
I had a question.
Go ahead.
So specifically, I'm finding it a little hard to understand how does utilitarianism, like, what's the argument for utilitarianism being naturalistic? Like, it seems a little unintuitive to me.
Sure. Yeah. So the point is that utilitarians think that, yeah, rightness is about utility maximizing. And utility, it does very much seem like a naturalistic property, right? Like utility is just about states of the brain, what makes people feel good or bad, and those are ultimately things that are part of the natural world. The question for utilitarianism is whether, even if utility is naturalistic, utilitarianism might not be naturalistic because the rightness or moral goodness might not be naturalistic. And so it's a complicated question whether utilitarianism is itself naturalistic. There's no clear agreement on this among philosophers. But yeah, so does that make any more sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. I'm going to go over another thing quite quickly here, and then I'm going to go on to a rival deontological view to utilitarianism. Another one on epistemology, and this is probably something you can do a little bit quicker. So if you don't have enough time for detailed discussion in a speech, maybe this is useful. Epistemology, just philosophy of what we know. We've got uniquely strong intuitions that pain and pleasure are respectively bad and good. And pretty much every society throughout history has thought this. So this might give us some reason to think, some pretty strong reasons to think that utilitarianism is the right moral theory. Compare this to deontology, right? So deontological views, we'll get more onto them later. But the rough idea there is they don't decide what the right action is by deciding what would make the world a good or bad place, and then the right action is just whatever brings about a better state of affairs as opposed to a worse one. Deontological systems instead define right action in terms of rules that people have to follow, and it's often not a matter of what the consequences of what you do are. The problem with those views is that there's far less agreement on what those rules are, and different societies throughout history, even right now, hugely disagree on what the right basic moral principles are. However, there's massive agreement that pain is bad and that pleasure is good, right? So does this give a strong reason to believe in utilitarianism? Well, maybe, but it's not something that is the end of the story. As I said here, obviously there isn't massive agreement on utilitarianism, but there is agreement on whether pain and pleasure are good or bad. And some utilitarians think we can infer from that utilitarianism is probably true. There are difficulties here, though. It's not clear that our moral intuitions here can be trusted. The assumption here is that if everybody agrees on something in morality, that it's more likely to be true. Not at all clear why that is. There's lots of factors that might distort our moral intuitions. Maybe it's maybe it's a matter of where we grew up or about our selfishness and so on. It's a little bit difficult to make those arguments against utilitarianism just because pretty much everyone thinks that pain and pleasure are good or bad, and it's not obvious why that's something that is selfish. But at the very least, we could just question, maybe we don't understand morality, maybe our intuitions about it aren't good. The problem for this, though, is that this is pretty dangerous for an opponent of utilitarianism to say, because so many of the strongest, most famous objections to utilitarianism are thought experiments that show that utilitarianism has morally disgusting consequences. I mentioned one example earlier. Has anybody heard of, quite a lot of these are pretty famous and you might have heard them in debates. Anyone heard of thought experiment saying utilitarianism leads to really, really dodgy looking moral decisions? Yeah, so one example would be the stuff I mentioned earlier on forced organ donation, right? If utilitarianism is true, maybe we should just take people off the street, steal their organs, give them to people who, to 5 people who need them. Another example that I think Tejas, when I've seen him speak, likes to use quite a lot, is an example called utopia. So in this case, there's a city that's a paradise, right? Everyone who lives in there is incredibly happy. But it turns out that there's a machine in the bottom of the city, uh, and in that machine is a child. The machine tortures the child, and I mean, this is science fiction here, but it's just a thought experiment. Um, Something about that machine, by torturing the child, produces the energy, the resources, whatever, that is needed to make the city happy. So there's far more utility, both in total and on average, if that child is tortured than if they're not. But a lot of us would not think that it is morally acceptable to torture that child, even if there's going to be a big loss to utility anyway. Um, Utilitarians are going to have to bite the bullet on that. And a lot of the objections to utilitarianism are based on those sorts of thought experiments. My point here is that if somebody tries to counter utilitarianism by saying, well, even if we have really strong moral intuitions that pain is bad and pleasure is good, maybe our moral intuitions can't be trusted, that's going to be pretty dangerous for them, because that then, if they've said that, then a lot of their counterexamples to utilitarianism aren't going to be as convincing. Um, and final thing I've said at the bottom there, it's really not clear that we can do normative ethics at all if we're not relying on moral intuitions to some extent. If we don't allow ourselves to trust any of our intuitions about what's right and wrong, it doesn't seem that we're going to be able to ever come up with theories about what we ought to do. And so that doesn't seem like a method that we're going to be able to proceed from. Does that sort of overall argument make sense to people?
I have a question on that.
Go
So,
ahead.
are you saying that utilitarianism overall is more socially and like, when you're talking about like the scale, it's more accepted by the society and it universally more believable? If you're saying that, then I was wondering, because deontology also have the one of the principles of universality. If something is socially acceptable by the larger amount of people or the whole of society, so what gives utilitarianism more credibility when we are making the argument that it's more trusted by the society and it's more accepted by everyone? Universality specifically.
Yeah. So this is an important thing to be careful about. So obviously, utilitarianism itself, as a theory, is not something that most people believe. However, even though there is not at all social agreement that utilitarianism is true, far from it, as you said, there is social agreement that pain is bad and that pleasure is good. And utilitarians think, because there is so much agreement on that, and because there's so little agreement on most other moral principles, like for instance, so little agreement on so many other moral principles, we should assume at the outset that what we're most confident in is that pain is bad and pleasure is good, and we should adopt whichever other moral principles follow from that. Now, it may be that the moral principles that we get from that weren't things that we believed at the start, but if we follow the path from things that we are very confident in to more controversial moral principles, we may arrive at stuff that we didn't believe at the start, but that's okay, so long as we have reason to think that the process that got us there was a reliable one. And utilitarians think it is, because they're so confident that pain is incredibly bad, that pleasure is good, and that there's nothing else that we can be nearly as sure of within morality as that. Does that make some sense? I'm aware that this is a little bit complex, but
No, it's more clear. Thank you.
okay, great. Going ahead, I'm going to go past that just in the interest of time. Contractualism. This is the other view we're going to talk about. And if the free will stuff may be dropped in the interest of time, but you'll still have the PowerPoint and people can follow me up on that. Contractualism. So this is a deontological view, as we've mentioned. Deontology, as I briefly alluded to earlier, is a different kind of different sort of family of views within normative ethics. It's not one view. There isn't one view that's deontology. There are a lot of different theories of deontology. What all theories of deontology have in common is that they, remember utilitarianism first, right? That started by deciding on what made a state of affairs good or bad, how much pleasure or pain it contained, and then defining rightness in terms of what maximizes the good state of affairs and what minimizes the bad ones. Deontological views work differently. They don't start by considering what makes a state of affairs in the world good or bad. They instead start by deciding which principles it is okay for individual people to act on. And that is the foundation of their view. And they actually are going to have to accept a lot of the time, and we're going to see this as we go on, that sometimes doing the right thing is going to lead to bringing about a world that is not, from an objective standpoint, as good as it could be. But that doesn't matter because people fundamentally, the starting point for morality begins with the rules. This will become a little bit clearer as we move forward and illustrate it. And I'm going to talk about contractualism here just because I think it's one of the more popular deontological views nowadays, and it's particularly easy to define. So thought it'd be useful here. Contractualism. Contractualism is defined as follows. An act is wrong if and only if doing it would be forbidden by a set of rules that nobody could reasonably reject, and otherwise the action's permissible. We're going to ignore here what makes an action required as opposed to merely permissible. That's a more difficult question, but there's enough to focus on just here. That's a lot of words in the definition, but the basic idea is simple enough. We should act in ways, and I think somebody mentioned this earlier in a question, that we can justify to everybody, right? I should act in ways that affect you, that I can justify to you. And if I can't justify to you what I'm doing, then I shouldn't be doing it. Importantly, this doesn't mean that everyone would in fact agree with our justification of what we're doing. We're just saying that the right thing something is only permissible if there wouldn't be any reasonable grounds for somebody to disagree with what we're doing. So obviously, actually, we're going to talk about the obvious thing later. Quickly, just on some brief motivations for contractualism. Contractualism tries to balance freedom with equality, right? So the idea is that I should be free to do what I want so long as I respect other people's equality with me. This is pretty different from utilitarianism. Utilitarians think I've got to do whatever maximizes utility, right? No matter what that is. And so that is not only something that can undermine my freedom, but it can also undermine other people's freedom. That person that we spoke about earlier, the child being tortured underneath the wonderful city, they don't have a lot of freedom down there. Somebody whose organs I stole to do the transplant, they don't have a lot of freedom. Utilitarianism is not a view that has a lot of sympathy towards freedom being a fundamental moral value. And that leads to some consequences that people find pretty awful. And there's this Kantian idea here as well, treating people as ends in themselves, not as means to an end. This is sort of more fluffy rhetoric. I'm not always as on board with that slogan. I'm not sure it's that clear, but some people like it. So there you go, if you do. As I said, so yeah, advantages in more detail. Better, more intuitive results anyway than utilitarianism in a lot of cases. So forced organ donation is one of them. That's kind of aggregation, which we're going to talk about later. But also other cases like free riding. So think, for example, that there's a beautiful rose garden, right? And that it's in a park, and a lot of people pass it on the way to work. They sit at their in their lunch break or whatever, go there with their kids. Everyone loves it. And I love the roses in the garden. So as I'm going past, I decide I'm going to take one home with me. Now, one rose missing from the garden not gonna hurt anybody, right? It makes a tiny difference. Barely anybody's gonna notice it. No real difference to utility, and it would make me very happy. So an act utilitarian is definitely gonna have to accept that I'm permitted and maybe even required to take the rose from the garden. Contractualism doesn't accept that. Because the problem with my doing that would be that I'm what is called free riding on other people. In other words, I'm doing something that if everybody did it would lead to awful consequences. If everyone took a rose, if everyone thought like me and took a rose from the garden, then there'd be no roses left and everyone would be miserable. So by taking one from the garden, I am in effect treating myself as having different moral standards applying to me than to other people. I want other people to live by rules that I'm not prepared to live by myself. And contractualists think that this is really, really problematic. It's deeply, deeply selfish. Even in trivial cases that don't seem that important, like the rose in the garden, if you think about them closely, there's something really quite selfish and a bit gross going on there. So they take that stuff very seriously, and a lot of people find that quite appealing. I'd be interested. People seem to have very different, when I talk to people seem to have very different intuitions about the rose in the garden. And before I'd thought about it, I probably would have said, yeah, it's fine, whatever. I find myself coming more on board with the idea that really that isn't an okay thing to do. But anyway, we're going to talk a little bit more about aggregation. So aggregation just means basically summing up effects on lots of different people together and doing things for the greater good. So like in the organ donation case, right? Each of those people, we sum up the benefits that each of those 5 people getting an organ from that person we killed, we sum up all those benefits and they're greater than the harm that is done to that one person. Utilitarianism is super on board with aggregation, obviously. Contractualism isn't. And because of that, contractualism might be thought to have some more intuitive consequences, but there are some problems that emerge as we look at this more closely. And we need to be very careful about this. First off, though, on what reasonably objecting to a principle means. So this just means that the principle harms me in some way and that it doesn't harm someone else even more. Now, this allows for some principles saying that we should maximize pleasure and minimize pain. It might be that some alternative principles that don't try to produce more pleasure or pain, maybe those principles might be objected to, right? If we have a principle that says, moral principle that says, we're not gonna do anything to look after the poor, obviously that's going to produce a lot of pain, and that would be grounds for a reasonable objection to the principle. So it's not as if contractualists don't care about people being happy or sad. Of course they care about that. It's just that these aren't the only things that matter. So think about the organ case, right? In the organ case, the person who's being killed has reasonable grounds to object to that principle. They've got the reasonable grounds obviously being that they're being killed, right? And so because there is a reasonable objection to a principle permitting us to kill people, to transplant their organs to people who need organ donations, because there can be a reasonable objection to that principle, and because there isn't anybody else that's even more harmed by that principle, this is something that we can reject, and so we can explain, if we find it intuitive that we shouldn't kill people to transplant their organs, we can explain why we shouldn't. This all seems pretty good so far, I would think. Seems like this is a really sensible view, and that we're getting the best of both worlds, getting the caring about pleasure and pain, which obviously we should, without the awful consequences. Unfortunately, things become a little bit more complicated. The first thing to notice is that contractualists don't just think that all harms are about my well-being, about pleasure or pain. So to see this, I want you to consider 2 principles, right? For the distribution of happiness, right? Let's just, for simplicity, suppose that there's, some chemical I can inject you with that's going to make you really happy, right? I guess there are chemicals like that. They're just illegal. And consider 2 principles that we could use to distribute that chemical. So one of them is random and one of them is racist. So one of them is random, and it just, across the population, we just randomly decide who gets them, right? And let's say it turns out that 10% of the population gets them. The other principle is racist. It's, suppose that 10% of the population is black. This principle says we're only going, suppose that 90% of the population is black and 10% is white. We're only going to give it to, we're only going to give it to the 10% of the population that's white. We might think that the racist principle's worse, right? It's unfair. It's not treating people with respect. But notice that we can't object to the racist principle by saying it harms the racist principle harms somebody more than the random principle does. And so that person would have grounds to reasonably object to it. That's not something you can say because that's false. According to both principles, the same number of people, exact same number of the people, 10%, end up with the happy making serum. So we need if we're going to explain what's wrong with the racist principle of only giving it to white people as opposed to doing it randomly, we need some other reason. So contractualists sometimes say things like the racist principle harms people in another way. It's not just about whether they get the chemical, but it's the other harms that result from like failing to fully respect people as moral equals. This, again, might sound fine. There are problems on the horizon. I'll go back to this in a bit, but I'm first going to skip ahead to this one. Is everyone clear with me so far on what contractualism is? Roughly, we're gonna get into the issues now, because unfortunately, good though this sounds, this is not going to be a solution, or at least it's not a definite solution. Is everyone clear on where we are? Okay, cool. Let's go ahead. Here's an example. And I forget the name of this philosopher. I think it was a guy called something Tarek. And there's been a lot of good writing on it recently by a British woman called Amia Srinivasan at Oxford, who's done a lot of really good work on this. Example is the rocks, right? 6 innocent swimmers trapped on 2 rocks by the incoming tide. 5 of them are on one rock, last one's on the other rock. And unless we go and rescue them, every one of them is going to drown. The tide's going to come up, they can't swim, they're screwed. You're the only lifeguard. You've got time to get to one rock in your patrol boat, and you can save everybody. But because of the distance between the rocks and the speed of the tide, they're far apart, tide's coming in, you got to move fast. You're not going to be able to get to both rocks in time to save people. You're either going to have to depending on what you do, either the 5 people are going to die or the 1 person is going to die. What should you morally do? Now, I take it as pretty obvious that you are, at very least, permitted to go save the 5 people, but I think much more than that, you're required to go save the 5 people. If you didn't do that, you would have done a really morally wrong thing. Contractualism may not be able to explain why this is, and if it can't, then as much as people complain that utilitarianism is unintuitive, deontological views like contractualism have big problems too. Let's think about it. How could the 5 people make a reasonable objection to their principle? So remember, we're going to decide whether something's wrong by thinking about every individual that the action affects and seeing whether they can object to a principle that would allow that action. How could they make a reasonable objection? Well, they can't do it by saying that there are more of them, right? That's not an individual reason about what harm is done to them. The whole point of contractualism, remember, was meant to be that we avoided things like the organ donation by prohibiting people from making reasonable objections based on things that happen to groups. We wanted to assess it by things that happen to individuals. But now in this case, they can't object by saying that there's more of them. They can only point out, each of the 5 people on the rock can only point out what happens to them if they're not saved. And what happens to them is drowning, and that is very bad. But the person on the other rock has just as strong an objection. So given that, there isn't an obvious way for contractualists to explain what's wrong with a principle that doesn't allow you to go and save the 5 people. Contractualism doesn't obviously have a way of doing that. It would seem that contractualism would require something like a coin toss, right? Because that's what gives everyone equal chances of survival. Coin toss, 50-50 chance, I go save the 5 people or the 1 people. And if we do a coin toss principle, then nobody is left worse off than anybody else individually. And so everyone has, a fair and equal chance. But this is really weird. We shouldn't be tossing a coin here. We should be going right to the 5 people as fast as possible. Some people try to get out of this. I forget who it was that did this objection, but some people try and mess around with that weird idea of harm we mentioned earlier. So they say something like, the problem with coin tossing, if there's 5 people on one rock and 1 person on the other, is that if you do a coin toss, you're saying that it makes no difference that there are 5 rather than 1. And so you're treating me as if I wasn't there, and that doesn't show respect for me. Now, a first problem with this is just that this really seems to be stretching the definition of harm now. You're just playing with words at this point. And it's not clear that you're going to be able to explain what those words, why that counts as harm. But there's another problem with this as well, and I'm gonna go back here because I think this is important. How do I go back? Yes. There's a question here as to whether, if you're going to play around with words like that, whether your view is just circular. Contractualists tried to define wrong by saying things that there's something is wrong if it is ruled out by a principle that nobody has a reasonable objection to. And we defined reasonable objection in terms of, we initially tried defining reasonable objection by saying someone's got a reasonable objection to the principle if it harms them, and if alternatives to that principle wouldn't harm somebody else even more. And that all seemed fine, but now we've started allowing into the definition of harm words like unfair and lack of respect. And so if we look again at our definition, we've now ended up with something like what I've shown here. An act's wrong if it's forbidden by a set of rules that nobody could reasonably reject. And nobody could reasonably reject a set of rules only if those rules didn't allow us to do any moral wrong to anyone. So we've just ended up saying an act is morally wrong if and only if doing it would be forbidden by rules that don't allow us to morally wrong anyone. And yeah, obviously, everybody, no matter what you think about ethics, would agree with that. But that doesn't tell us anything. That doesn't explain anything about what moral wrongness actually is. This is a big problem, not just for contractualism, but for a lot of deontological views. If you define morality in terms, saying that things are morally wrong if they don't violate certain rules, the problem that you run into a lot, without first defining what a good or bad state of affairs is, in terms of pleasure or pain or something that you can define independently of moral wrongness, you wind up in this kind of circular question. If you try to follow Kant and say, a fundamental moral principle is that everybody should be allowed freedom so long as that doesn't interfere with somebody else's freedom, we then ask a question like, well, what's freedom? And that might mean something like doing whatever, freedom means the ability to do whatever you want without things that compromise other people's equality or their freedom. And ultimately, as you chase down what these words mean, you often end up saying something like, things are morally wrong if they are morally wrong. And that is not a helpful definition. So as appealing as views like contractualism are, I'd ask you to think whether you're going to be able to define these ultimately in a way that actually says something, rather than just saying something that is circular. Do people sort of see what that problem might be? Are people with me here? Okay, cool.
I think there's a question in the chat though.
Sorry, I'm very bad at looking at chat. Where is the chat? Sorry, I was looking at my screen share and not at the chat. Give me a moment. Question in the chat. That's interesting. Yeah. So consenting into harms. I think it would be difficult. No, you could try applying it. I think in cases like this, if somebody consents into it, then they wouldn't be making a reasonable objection to the principle, because they don't view it as having harmed them. Although I suppose one of the interesting things that you could say is that maybe people can be wrong about what's good or bad for them. So if you think that, for instance, you know, yeah, if you think that people can just be fundamentally wrong about whether, ending their life would be good for them or not, then you might be able to say that their objections to a principle forbidding consensual cannibalism, maybe those objections would be reasonable because they don't take into account people's interests. Look, a complicated question, but in short, contractualists are probably fine with consensual cannibalism, I would expect. But if it genuinely is consensual and the person, the trouble with consensual cannibalism is that, like, most of the time people consenting into that are deeply mentally ill and so aren't in a position to consent properly. But yeah, anyway. I think there was one other thing I had to say about contractualism, and then we can move forward. Let me just go back to the PowerPoints. Yes. Slideshow. Other weird thing that happens with contractualism is, in the case that we just described, even if you think that contractualists can get out of it by saying something like, if you don't take into account there are more, that there are 5 people on the rock, you're treating me as if I wasn't there, and that disrespects me, and that's a harm. Even if you accept that in the case of a rock, where it's either 1 person dies or 5 people die, there's additional problems in cases where you're comparing 2 different sorts of harm, not the same harm to different numbers of people. So here, consider 2 states of affairs, right? So in A, 1 person suffers torture for 100 years. In B, oh no, okay, there's a typo on this slide. It should not say, I'm gonna cross that out. It should not say 1,000,000 years. It should say 100. That is my fault. So in the example, either 1 person suffers torture for 100 years or 1,000,000 people suffer torture for 100 years minus 1 day. Which state of affairs should the contractualist say is better? Or which one do they say? I mean, I think I take it that we all find it very intuitive that we prefer A to B here, right? 1,000,000 people suffering torture for only a very small difference in for how long they're suffering torture. That's way worse than 1 person suffering torture for 100 years. But can a contractualist explain that? It's not obvious that they can. An additional day of torture for that person who's suffering it is a really big harm, because any day of torture is a really big harm. So the person tortured in A, if we're deciding between A and B, the person who would be tortured if we chose A could say, look, if you choose A, I'm going to be harmed by you doing that, and the harm I'm going to suffer is bigger than the harm that any single person in B is going to suffer. And remember that contractualism was meant to be against aggregation. So at that point, it seems like she's got a reasonable objection to us choosing A instead of B. And unlike in the previous case, where it was the same harm and we could say, you're treating it as if it doesn't matter whether I'm there or not, that objection isn't going to be there here, because we're not comparing same harms, we're comparing different harms between people. So, like, final, upshot on this, I just want to emphasize the 2 problems I've mentioned. As I've tried to say, I focused on contractualism here just for clarity, but these are not just an issue for contractualism. These are an issue for a lot of non-consequentialist views in normative ethics. So the next time somebody in a debate tries using a thought experiment to explain why utilitarianism is unintuitive, maybe forced organ donation or the child being tortured in the Paradise City, I'd ask you to consider using some of these thought experiments to say, well, if you're not willing to sum up the harms and the benefits between people and do what is in the greater good, you're going to run into some really weird problems. And so if the thought experiments cancel each other out, then maybe we should go to the view that is more intuitive, or maybe we should go to the view that is better supported naturalistically. I'm not saying this is something you have to do, but I think that, and I actually, on a personal level, don't believe in utilitarianism, but I also think that debaters, I think, are a lot of the time too quick to dismiss utilitarianism based on one or two thought experiments. And that isn't actually something that that I think is always the best idea. And as I've said, a great example here of the objections that I've mentioned, some of the objections I've mentioned appearing in a really, really strong round is this wonderful closing government case that I've linked. It was from the Doxbridge World semi-finals in 2021 or 2022. It's from Tin Puljich and Dylan McCarthy in Closing Government. Dylan McCarthy, again, I really do think is one of, yeah, there's an awful lot of Dylan speeches with some incredible philosophy in them, so I'd encourage you to look for some of those. But yeah, include a YouTube link there. I think about like 5-10 minutes left, so if anyone has any final questions, I am happy to answer them now. And I'm sorry we didn't get on to free will, but I thought it was more important not to rush over this stuff even more than I already have. It's the trouble with philosophy. You keep asking questions and more objections, and it becomes hard to answer anything.
Yeah, I just have one question. I think it's not something that's like directly related to what you covered, but I think you pointed out at one point that we have to begin at intuition or the moral intuition that we all presumably share to some degree to have any kind of basis for like normative ethics, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so so my question is then that our intuition is like presumably to a large extent built biologically, right? A lot of these like thought experiments are things that are like some things that seem far too obvious to us, or some things that are obviously true, right? So if this intuition was like built up in, I don't know, a hunter-gatherer society or whatever, while now we live in a very different world, which probably requires a very different intuition. So this looks like we live in a society where there are like particular contracts that we have, which give us responsibilities and so on. So do you think then the question of like where our intuition itself comes from becomes important in how we can choose our moral theories and so on? And this is probably not very important for debates, but like, I just have to
No. I actually I think it's really interesting, and this is like evolutionary ethics is something that's it's come a lot of people have started thinking about these questions, like professional philosophers in the last 20 years, and I'm super interested in it. And I could send you some fun papers on this. So this is a problem. So one of the big worries that people have is, well, we got our moral intuitions from biology, right? It seems very plausible when we as humans or just even earlier primate ancestors, whatever, evolved these moral intuitions because they were, if we cared about other people, cared about their pleasure or pain, at least people in our sort of close community or family or whatever, if we cared about them, then we would help them. And if we helped them, then we would survive. And that was evolutionarily selected for through natural selection. And so there's a worry that a lot of people have that, well, if that's where our moral intuitions come from, then why should we trust them? Why should we think they're a guide to truth? Because obviously what evolution was selecting for, evolution was just selecting for what led to the survival and reproductive success and ultimately the genome being passed down. It wasn't anything to do with moral truth, right? That wasn't what evolution was selecting for. And so a lot of people distrust their intuitions. One of the interesting comebacks to that is that if something like, for instance, pain or pleasure or caring about our family members and so on, if that happens to be the moral truth, then the fact that we were evolved to have intuitions that care about pain and pleasure because that helped for survival success, if that was where our evolutionary intuitions came from, and our moral intuitions came from, sorry, through evolution, and if something like utilitarianism is true, then despite the fact that we weren't evolved to, despite the fact that evolution wasn't deliberately selecting for moral truth, it accidentally selected for moral truth. So that's one possibility. However, that doesn't directly answer your question as to, given the evolutionary origin of our intuitions, why should we have any trust in them? And so this is very complicated. A lot of this relates to, I'm not going to be able to explain this fully here, but one of the really big problem this touches on isn't within normative ethics, really. It's within meta-ethics. So meta-ethics is, instead of, normative theories like utilitarianism and deontology fight over what makes an action right or wrong, right? What the correct theory of that is. Meta-ethics is about something different. It's sort of higher order. It's about what rightness and wrongness are, whether they're objective, whether they're in some sense just a matter of opinion and so on. If it's the case that morality isn't an objective matter that's just out there in the world, a mind-independent fact about the world, and the same facts about right or wrong were true before we existed, would be true after we existed, would be true even if we all had them wrong. If that's the case, then reflection on our evolution might arguably lead us to have a lot of distrust for our intuitions. However, if morality isn't like that, if morality isn't something that's just out there in the world mind independently, if in some sense morality is a matter of what we feel and believe and if there aren't mind independent facts about morality, then some of the questions about whether our intuitions are accurate seem to be misplaced. Because if morality is just a matter of systematic, the right theory of morality is just the most systematic arrangement of the rules that we feel in and deeply believe, then it doesn't make sense to ask whether what we deeply feel and believe is right or wrong, because what we deeply feel and believe, with regard to things like pleasure or pain, constructs morality. So that's a really, really interesting question that, I don't know, I care a ton about this stuff. I did a lot of my coursework in my final year at Cambridge on this stuff. So I'm hyped that you asked that question. And if anybody wants more on that, I will send you some stuff that I've written on it or some papers. Yeah, it's really, really cool stuff.
Yeah,
Okay,
can do that.
hope
It
this
will be
was
very
useful. I'm
interesting.
aware this was all a bit oh, sorry, were you asking something else or?
No, I was just saying that if you could share some of those papers, it would be interesting. Like if you could share
Yeah.
that.
I'm on Facebook Messenger. Fraser McConachie messaged me. I'll just wrap up. I'm aware that some of this stuff was maybe a little bit complicated, and maybe there weren't as many thought pumpy intuitions as some other lectures give you. But I wanted to give people a bit of a picture of what you can do with philosophy in motions that really allow you to think about it more deeply, the kind of level that you can take it to. And I would encourage people to, in motions where you've got the time to do it, try and go beyond just intuitions and thought experiments. Because I think, as we've shown here, thought experiments there can be thought experiments against utilitarianism, thought experiments for it. It's hard to win debates in normative ethics based on thought experiments. And in a lot of ways, the way that normative ethics nowadays is developing academically as a discipline is to move away from some of that stuff and to try and think about things like naturalism, and to think about things like which intuitions we can trust and why we should trust them, whether morality is objective or not. That's the way that I think the academic discipline is moving. And actually, in debate rounds where you're going to go against people that are going to be able to come up with these different thought experiments, the really sophisticated winning stuff is often to do with thinking in these more complex ways. And so I think both of the cases that I've linked here are examples of debaters who were ambitious and tried to go beyond the obvious, and really see what you can do with it. So yeah, hopefully you guys have enjoyed it and got something out of it. Please feel free to message me if you want anything more. I will be happy to talk about ethics. I love this stuff. Yeah, thanks guys.
Yeah, thank you so much.